There's a difference between stories set in a fantasy setting and fantasy stories. Stories with fantasy elements often use that to make their primary plots, which is romance or drama, historical, politics, detective work, mystery, action, more interesting, like adding a 3D background to a 2D character. Whereas fantasy stories usually focus on the world that the writer created and try to use the uniqueness of a non-modern world to tell a good story. A perfect example of a story with fantasy elements is the infuriatingly, annoyingly amazing show that is Game of Thrones. A show that ruined my life for 2 weeks straight when I just, was it 3? I just binged it this year because I'd never seen it before. I was watching The Walking Dead, so I just didn't have the time for that. While the White Walkers and the magic and the witches and stuff were all good and done, they were good plots and good plot points, anybody could tell that the real main crux of the story, the real purpose of the story was to detail political struggles and drama. Especially after season 8. Whereas Princess Mononoke, which is a amazing Studio Ghibli movie, amazing 10 out of 10, amazing movie, please watch it if you haven't, is what I would call a perfect fantasy story. Its entire plot, its main reason of being is to detail a war in a magical forest. That's to the point where you cannot separate the people, the setting, or the world, or the plot at all from fantasy, from the fantasy world that it is set in, compared to Game of Thrones, which if it just took out the fantasy, that wouldn't impede on the main storyline too much. Regardless of which you prefer, in both scenarios, the world needs to be explained in an easy to understand, subtle manner so that neither the reader nor the viewer have any misconceptions about the context and the world that they have been or they will try to be transported into. And there is one way of doing this, of explaining this world, that is just as prevalent as it is contested. In this video, I will be explaining what infodumping is. I will be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the trope to explain and show that it is contested, and I will also be talking about why it is prevalent. And if you have time, check out my description, there might be something fun for you to do down there. So section 8, the first thing to figure out, what is infodumping in fantasy stories, specifically fantasy stories, because I need some direction, okay? I need some direction. If I went infodumping everywhere, we'd be here all day we would be, I'm telling you. So firstly, I wanted to get a gauge of how it's seen in the community in general. So I went onto Reddit because of course I did love Reddit, recommend Reddit. I don't think I need to recommend Reddit, but you know, love Reddit. And somebody said that infodumping to them is more than 2 sentences or so of expository writings, so background information, that does not concern the immediate sensory experience of the viewpoint characters, so the characters that we are looking through their lenses of, like the main characters, the important side characters, etc, etc. So that's basically just saying that any writing that is expository, so it's telling us about the background of the world, that isn't talking about the immediate sensory experiences of the protagonist or the side characters, is infodumping. Interesting. There was one more comment after that actually that I wanted to touch on, and they say, I agree with this, adding that the length where exposition becomes infodump is subjective to the reader. So we're getting the big key word here. We're getting that this length of this writing, about background information that isn't about sensory experiences and what they're saying, what they're doing, what they're feeling, is infodumping depending on the length that it is written. And this length that determines whether this is just fine or infodumping is subjective. We're getting a keyword here, subjective, which I'll touch upon later. Next, we're trying to come to a consensus, guys. We're trying to think about what is making infodumping unique as a trope. How are we going to flesh out this definition when I eventually tell you what I came to? Well, I thought, why not go to psychology? I mean, I'm a psychology student X, but will be another one in a second when I go back. So I wanted to utilize that. So I looked at this psychology paper, which said that this temptation to infodump can happen both at small or line level and at large or structural level. So saying that this expositionary writing, which doesn't concern the sensory experience and is subjective depending on the length, happens at a smaller level, or they will do it as a big structural level. They're just going to frame their story around info dumping, so they'll be always introducing new things, always doing it, yada yada yada, versus once upon a time when the war started. Like, that's the line version of it. We're kind of a bit all over the place right now. I am understanding that. So I think going to a nice little wiki page would be nice to unify us a bit more. Again, I'm going to be unifying it at the end, but you know, trying to figure out what more can we add. Wikipedia says that an information dump, more commonly known as an info dump, is a large drop of information by the author to provide a background they deem necessary to continue the plot. They're saying that this expositionary writing that is necessary to the plot, even if it is subjective in length, and it might happen on a big scale or small scale in the story. Looking further, the writing practice really helps to bring it together even more, even tightly, by comparing it to being drenched in water. They say that it's what happens when the author gives the reader a massive amount of background information in a matter of pages instead of letting the story unfold, which highlights the pace of info dumping. I mean, we've talked about length, we've talked about subjectivity, we've talked about instead of sensory writing, we've talked about the scale, but we haven't talked about pace. This talks about the fact that it is usually fast-paced or just kind of forced in there, even though it is necessary. It is quicker than a slower pace would be. Lastly, a philosophy paper, didn't know they still wrote those. I don't know, but a philosophy paper on climate change education suggests that depending on the tone of information, if done too much, it could contribute to anxiety, cognitive exhaustion, and can ultimately lead to hopelessness and paralysis in the face of ecological issues. So obviously we can't apply something talking about climate change information and the negative effects of climate change information directly to the negative effects of info dumping in media. However, what we can compare is just the general idea that it has a negative effect on people and it can bore people, essentially. So here's the definition. Finally, here is what I think info dumping should be defined as. An info dump is a large amount of expository writing that doesn't concern the immediate sensory experience. Some might deem this necessary for the plot, while others may wish this was shared at a slower pace to avoid a negative viewing experience of fantasy stories or stories with fantasy elements in them. This info dumping trope is polarizing in fantasy stories, and there are many reasons why. Like with many things in life, I wanted to go hard and fast with this next section. And that's not me making a dirty joke. That's me talking about clicking my mouse, eating delicious food, and sleeping. I like to go hard and fast. So we're talking positives first. Really, the first positive thing that came to mind about info dumping was how quick it was. It was mentioned before. It has a quicker pace. And so if we use an example, I'm going to use an example, Catherine. Catherine is just a game about this protagonist who is cheating on his wife because he's being eluded by some visage of this woman or this person he's seeing, and in his dreams he could potentially die, and that's the whole premise of it. And so you have to fight as a sheep that he becomes in his dreams, and also figuring out why he's cheating and how to get out of that. I don't know the ending of the game, so I don't know what's going to happen with it, how the ending is going to be, but it is a solid game and it's enjoyable, and the music is great. It's a game which I loved to play. I got gifted it. I actually heard the OSTs outside of, I think it was like in a playlist, and I heard them, I really liked them, and I decided, okay, what is this game about? Put it on my wish list. My friend bought it for me. I play it sometimes. Puzzles are tough, but I try my best. It's a great game. The thing is I really didn't know what it was about. I had no idea what it was about. And the game did a good job, I think, at info dumping me in a really good way. In the beginning, they have this whole TV segment. They introduce the game to you. They show like with a screen and stuff, and they're like, here is what's going on, XYZ. And that whole process of info dumping, because it is short and because it is sweet, and because the game is already like, what is going on, you're already confused, it really allows you to focus less on the entire mystery of the thing, but more the actual gameplay itself, which is the visual novel aspect of it and the puzzles aspect of it. Because of course you could be figuring out everything, but you still are figuring out things. But you do need to, I feel like it's very good that they showed us the context of what was happening. I don't know, maybe it's just this one game that I feel this for. Maybe some other games I wouldn't enjoy it for, but for Catherine, I really truly think that they used info dumping in a great way. It was quick, painless right at the start, but in an engaging enough way. It wasn't mukashi. It wasn't like, once upon a time. It was very, a TV news report, something you would see anywhere. And then it just introduced you into the story, and you felt less disorientated because of it, because it was already disorientating enough as a story. So it grounded it in a very fast, quick way. Another great thing about info dumping is that it explains everything and anything. There is no confusion that is had by the viewer. So an example for this is Monsters Inc. Monsters Inc., the classic movie. Everybody's watched it. If you haven't watched it, please watch it. It's an amazing movie. This whole video is just me recommending loads of fantasy stories. It's a movie about two co-workers figuring out what is going on with their workplace and the doors that they are scaring children in. And it essentially, the intro scene is a highlight. The intro scene is very, if anybody's seen the movie, you'll remember it immediately. It's got this trainee showing him the ins and outs of the job and helping to guide him through it. And that whole intro scene is what I would consider an info dump of perfection. It explains everything so clearly that even though we're in a place where we have no idea, it's not a typical fantasy story, it's not a typical idea of a workplace of monsters, very unconventional idea, especially at the time. And so just by humanizing them and showing a training being put into place is something that could easily connect with the things we already have in our minds about how the workplace exists and stuff like that. And so yeah, it is super solid and explains things in a very easy to understand way, with also foreshadowing different plots. Those are the primary solid advantages I could think of for info dumping, that it is quick and that it is very clear, makes everything clear to understand. However, when I looked online, I can't lie to you, there were definitely more people saying that they disliked info dumping. If you've heard of the trope info dumping before, even you probably were like, I don't like info dumping, because that's kind of the consensus, even though there is positive aspects of info dumping that exist, especially in fantasy stories. And so I also want to talk about the negative side of info dumping. So what are some negative points? Well, people dislike info dumping for the same reason they dislike burnt toast, because it's boring, stale, tasteless. Especially in the beginning of the story, there's this manhwa that I was reading, The Great Mage Returns After 4,000 Years. I mean, that name, if you read manhwa, that's the textbook name. Like, that was so boring. But there are some good manhwas which are coming out which have boring names because they need to fit in, right? So you just find the diamond in the rough, even though they're all looking the same. And so I was hoping for the best, but the whole beginning chapter is this info dump, and oh my days, it was boring because the thing is, we didn't really get to see or learn about his backstory through the story. I mean, we don't need to see the build up much. I mean, if you wanted to show it, maybe do half a chapter, quarter of a chapter, but they did the whole first chapter was just him getting isekai'd, and I was like, love, we've already seen it, we don't need more. We know what it's gonna look like. We do. I was yawning, I thought asleep. It was boring, tasteless. It pushed me away from wanting to read it. I still read more, but I should have taken that as a sign. And it's not in a subtle way either. The way that they did it, it was just dragging, and the placement of it wasn't great. So yeah, I think that info dumping can definitely be seen as boring. I mean, that idea of the title was boring enough, and the art style was standard enough. Like, they needed more to explain what makes this unique, and the first chapter did not do that. that. A second reason why people dislike info dumping is because info dumping often is in the middle of stuff like action and hype, something exciting, high tension. So compared to the beginning of the Great Mage story, this happens in the middle of something. And a great example of this is Attack on Titan. If you haven't seen season 3 part 2, I believe, then just like skip to this point. I personally wasn't bored by this part, which was essentially Grisha's memories. So you see after Erwin dies and everything, with Levi and Armin and everyone surviving, we get Eren going to the basement, finding out Grisha's memories. We're understanding what's going to happen for season 4 and onwards. She's that mess of an ending. Anyways, yeah, so we see Grisha's memories, and a lot of people were saying, it's so boring, I don't want to know. We just had really hype moments, and it barely went down before we got this. And so it's kind of like we wanted more action, we wanted more excitement, we wanted more, but they just kind of side plotted and said, hey, the basement, and just this retelling, the world is like bigger now. And it wasn't really that exciting of a story either. Like, if they wanted to show another world, they should have still kept that hype going, because Attack on Titan is very great with action, very amazing with sci-fi, just wonderful in the ways that they do exciting scenes, and that things that downplay and slow it down kind of feel boring. Even in, I think, season 3 part 1, there were slower parts where they were undercover, like the Survey Corps were undercover and stuff, that people also didn't like, because I guess it kind of split in the middle of the story, and it kind of didn't really feel as hype as Attacking Titans felt, or the Attack Titan felt. So I do understand why info dumping, like Grisha's memory specifically, would be seen and would be feeling as this drag, this kind of sobering experience that no one wanted. You were on a high, nobody wanted to be sober. Yeah, so that's basically the second point. Next is the fact that info dumping is excessive. It's just too much sometimes. You know how there was the point in the psychology paper about how it can be seen as on a bigger scale? That it applies here with the next example that I have, which is Jurassic Park, the movie. The classic one, not the reboot. I do like the reboot though, but the classic one. I rewatched that this year as well. I've been just like pop media. I've been watching a bunch of stuff and rewatching stuff, and the Jurassic Park movie, which I wasn't alive to watch when it came out, obviously, it was an amazing movie. But anybody with eyes knew that story with fantasy elements, the tour, the intro, it was dragging.
RuPaul who?
It dragged. If you don't know Jurassic Park, it's just a story about a park with an amusement, well, not an amusement park, but like a zoo, an exhibitory kind of park with real life dinosaurs they've recreated for the purpose of the park. It goes wrong. It's kind of like a disaster movie at the end of it. It's just, yeah, it's a really great movie. But jeez, that tour was, that was tough. That was a long tour. Until the action and things started picking up, it was a long build up of dinosaurs exist. Oh my god, dinosaurs exist. Oh my god, what? Dinosaurs exist. Yeah, we were doing this. Oh my god, yeah, like we got it. We understand. Can we get to the story or the plot or the action? So it takes like half the movie. So yeah, info dumping can often be excessive, even though it's informative and helpful and it was enjoyable. I still think it was enjoyable to build the characters. It can be very excessive and very long. The last point is that info dumping can be unnecessary. Info dumping is supposed to be this thing necessary for the plot, but sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes it's just redundant in a way. And so an example for this, as an anime example, is Spice and Wolf. The reboot came out. I watched the first episode. I kind of didn't love it. I tried to watch the original as well, like a while ago, maybe last year or something, and I didn't really love that either. But this reboot specifically is what I'm talking about, because in the intro scene, the wolf, I can't remember her name, Cammy something, the wolf god thing, she tells this story to this young girl about this wolf god who brings crops to the land, who stops bringing crops because of something else, and she ends up going on a trip with a merchant and they fall in love. It's a romance story with drama, fantasy elements, slice of life, I guess, because that's what it feels like, and in the countryside, which is one of my least favorite settings of all time. So maybe that was why. And yeah, so she tells a story to this young girl in the beginning. Oh, this wolf, who could have thunk it was me? But this wolf, I mean, we don't even realize it's her until the end of the scene, but like this wolf, she was doing so great stuff, but the villagers kind of forgot about her, and now it's not me, I swear, because obviously no one would believe that a humanoid, somebody in a human body, would actually be a wolf. And she explains the story of the crops, but then she meets the merchant and it gets explained all over again, with her being there and then him talking to somebody he's having dinner with somebody who also explains it. And it's like, do we need to explain the same story within the same episode twice? Like, the beginning, I feel, was just redundant. It was unnecessary. I mean, either you don't explain it when they had dinner, when the merchant has dinner with his friend, or you don't explain it in the beginning of the show. One or the other, because it was just, it repeated, and I was like, I'm not that stupid. Like, maybe you think I'm really dumb and I forget things, but 20 minutes this episode is. Like, I didn't forget. Like, I remembered the story. Like, you don't need to explain it. And it's not like they, like, both times they explained it for like 2-3 minutes. And I'm just like, why? Like, I got it. I got it the first time. Like, you don't need to. So I think, yeah, definitely that info dumping can sometimes be used as unnecessary. It's like this whole thing of why are you explaining it twice? Sometimes that happens in stories. And this is a great example of when it does. This is why info dumping in fantasy stories and stories with fantasy elements can be seen positively, but is mostly seen negatively. You'll mostly find people talking negatively about it online, in person, because in general it isn't really a liked trope. It's generally seen more as a bad writing method than a good one. So then, why does it exist in a professional writing space? Why is info dumping done even with the most well-written, well-crafted stories? Because if you didn't know, writers are humans who view things too. What they see as an info dump versus a normal amount of expositionary writing or expository writing is subjective entirely to them, the same way it is subjective to us. Often info dumps are unintentional. They could easily be seen as bad craft from a misguided writer who loves their world so much. They just want to talk so much about their fantasy world. They've made it. Like, I mean, it's not even a normal world. They want to explain everything they can about it. And often info dumping can be written intentionally because maybe the writer thinks that their fans and their viewers are incredibly impatient, and so they need to capture them. Fundamentally, in both cases, especially in fantasy stories, they are written to keep the viewer engaged. And when the writer themselves is the viewer, because often the writer themselves are reading their own writing, are viewing their own stories, that includes them. So as long as the writers and their target audiences, or their ideal target audiences in their minds, interests are kept, then the info dumping stays. Because who cares if somebody who doesn't watch your stuff or isn't going to watch much of your stuff, or you don't even care about them, or they're not you, says that the info dumping is too long if it keeps their ideal target audience engaged? Who cares? Who would care? Even if people are disinterested in a fantasy story because of the initial info dump, the people who push for it will ultimately say, it just wasn't for you. And the writer who is catering for those people, or simply just love their story and their world so much, will just likely agree with that and change nothing. This whole concept of extreme subjectivity in a trope applies to other contexts. Like romance webtoons in originals with slow burn plots, the vocal minority will be yapping on and saying, oh, it's boring, and they'll drop out. Whereas the majority of people, I don't know why, will just keep reading and will say, it just wasn't for them. This also applies to recipes online that are being shared with different people. People really can't say much. I mean, usually there's not like a functioning comment section there. And so if the writer isn't seeing much backlash or many people saying, oh, I don't like it, because the most people who finish it just don't really say anything. They kind of just read the recipe, see it, and they're like, all this fluff, I'll bypass it. It's fine, whatever. I won't really read much, but I'll just leave it alone. I'm not going to say much, because at the end of the day, I did read the recipe and I enjoyed using the recipe. If they are ultimately satisfied by the end of it, the writer will never change anything. And because they love what they've written, because for some reason I love adding this fluff to these recipes, they will just keep doing it over and over again. And then this kind of info dumping, in a sense, will continue. It applies to that too. So in sum, an info dump is an incredibly subjective part of the story. It is supposed to engage us in stories, especially fantasy stories or stories with fantasy elements, which need to be introduced in the first place, because if it was in a modern world, there are significantly less amount of things that need to be explained to the average viewer. While it has few advantages, it is a part of the story that will never be removed or spread across the story unless the writer thinks that the target audience, including themselves, don't like its existence or are being less engaged by its existence. And that is why info dumping is not necessarily a bad trope, but just a trope that is extremely subjective. But what do you think? If you want to do one thing, then subscribe, check out my other videos in the Not Bad Trolls playlist. Then take a quick bye. Bye.